This is Ayani,
And this is Corinne.
and welcome to another La Petite SLL, a sex love literature minisode.
This episode, instead of looking at a particular text, we reflect on the first year of SLL and ask the incredibly important question, why sex?
We get a little meta as we chat about our research, the ways we approach questions about sex, and the complexities of desire and desirability.
If you like what you hear, make sure to subscribe and maybe even leave us a review, but only if it's good.
And with that, on with the show. Hello and welcome everyone to this La Petite SLL. We are excited as always to have you join us for our conversation today. If you checked the title of this episode, you'll see it's a little bit different than some of the normal stuff that we do. So we've been recording SLL now for like a year, which is wild to think about. We kind of started this as a weird little project during the middle of the pandemic when we couldn't see each other in person and when we were feeling kind of isolated. And for me, it's definitely fulfilling something that I've wanted to do for a while in starting a podcast. But we were doing some retrospective thinking about starting this podcast, about why we're doing it, about what we're getting out of it. And we thought in kind of a meta kind of way, doing a little commentary about the podcast itself. So the way we thought about doing this, and Corinne, correct me if I'm over or under embellishing here, but the way we figured we'd do this is think about each of kind of our quote unquote key terms, right, in our title. Sex, love, and literature. And if you've been listening for a while, you'll know that all of these things kind of come up in different ways in our podcast throughout different episodes. But we thought it would be useful to really sit with each of these terms and think about both what they mean to us as scholars, but also why X? Why this thing? Why did we want to talk about this?
Another thing we kind of wanted to explain is what kinds of questions we immediately approach something with. Like when we're like when I told my mom we were doing an episode on why sex, she was like, what exactly are you going to be talking about there? But that is one of the things that we'll be addressing in this sort of mini-series. Another thing, and I'm sure we'll talk about this more when we get to the literature episode, is why we talk about so many television shows.
I mean, if you want an honest answer for that, it's because we already do so much reading for our degrees that we're like, no more reading, please. Thank you. But as Corinne said, this is our kind of why sex episode. But as we've been doing recently, before we dive into our main discussion, let's have a quick round of what's sparking joy. So Corinne, what is sparking joy for you right now?
So I'm going to go wild here. And instead of mentioning a K-drama, I'm going to tell you about a book.
Oh my God. Not a K-drama? I think she's lying. I think this isn't the truth.
I mean, I have also watched many K-dramas that I could have talked about. But so something that I read recently with my quarantine book club, which is another thing that's been going on for a little over a year. Wild.
Yeah, you should do a retrospective with them.
But we read Last Night at the Telegraph Club by Melinda Lowe, which is a queer young adult novel set in Chinatown in San Francisco in the 1950s. It's very, very good. It does a really good job of balancing the sort of historical aspects with realism, but also with hope. But it's a very, very good book. I definitely recommend checking it out. I will probably be teaching it this fall in my sex class.
Okay. You need to be more specific than that. You can't just say your sex class.
I know. I'm teaching a class this fall on sex in children's and young adult literature. So, yeah. And I think this text very much deserves a place in that course.
Excellent. So for me, I started reading a cute little manga this morning called Heterogenea Linguistico, An Introduction to Interspecies Linguistics by Salt Seno. And it's just super cute. It's about this linguist who goes, quote unquote, to the underworld where the quote unquote monsters live. But they're just like, right now, they're very much like RPG style monsters. Like there was a slime, there are wolfmen, there are lizard folk. And I'm not very far into it. I literally just started it this morning while like waiting for my brother to get out of the bathroom. And It's really delightful. There were quite a few moments where I, like, chuckled out loud, and I appreciate the fact that it's a story about it's a academic kind of story, but it's thinking about, I mean, would the linguistics be considered humanities? Is that humanities or is that
Uh,
social sciences?
I think it's maybe closer to social sciences, but I think it's on the border. But it sounds like this book is definitely playing a lot with form.
Yeah. Yeah. It's one of the things that they did that, if we're thinking really meta to form, is that the werefolk, they communicate largely through smell. So it's actually really taxing for them to be talking. So it's even
Mhm.
asking questions about types of communication and challenging and questioning the types of communication that we have as people, I suppose, in a way. So of course it's right up my alley because it's monsters, it's reading, it's words, and there's a cute little like half human, half werewolf girl, and she's adorable and has tiny little ears. So like that's making me really happy. I can't wait to finish it. I will probably buy more of it. But yeah, so that's what's sparking joy for us.
All right.
So sex. It's to be a little on the nose, it's the first word of our podcast title, and that's part of the reason why we chose to talk about it first. I think we are going to
Mhm.
go in order, talk about sex, and then talk about love, and then finalize or finish out with literature. That makes
Mhm.
sense. But it also, I think, colors a lot of the conversations that we have. And
Mhm.
part of that is because both Corinne and I, in one way, shape, or form, research sex, though we kind of take it from different angles. And I know,
Mhm.
Corinne, you've already talked a bit about this on the podcast, but I wanted to give the floor to you first to kind of talk a little bit about how sex factors into your research.
Yeah, so the sort of elevator pitch I have around my dissertation, which is on consent in young adult speculative fiction and fantasy, uh, is that I'm looking at consent in young adult literature, both as it relates to sex and more broadly. Uh, and so, even though my sort of key area of investigation is consent,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I sort of have to answer the like the sex question first because consent has become so, especially like affirmative consent, so like
mm-hmm.
yes means yes instead of no means no approach to sex has become so tangled up in sex that we forget sometimes that consent also matters in other arenas.
Mm-hmm.
So
Mm-hmm.
a lot of the times when I'm thinking about my research, when I'm approaching a text, I have to look at the way that sexual interactions and sex stuff and like the discourse around sex is functioning, and
Mm.
then I can sort of move out from there, but it often functions as a sort of obvious entry point for me.
Mm.
um
Mhm, mhm.
yeah, does that make sense?
Yeah, no, that makes perfect sense. It's kind of like you can't not talk about it,
Mhm.
even if you wanna broaden out the conversation. No, that makes complete and total sense.
Yeah, it's like when I was thinking about and when I was planning out my dissertation and my dissertation chapters, like one of my chapters is on sexual assault because I can't have a dissertation on consent and not think about sexual
Right.
assault.
Mhm,
So, like, one of the things, like, when we think about consent is like, what do you do when it has been violated? And the most obvious
mhm,
instance of
mhm.
that is in sexual assault. So,
Yeah, 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 yeah.
which is maybe interesting in thinking about, and maybe something that I like about the podcast is that, like, often right now in my research, I'm thinking about sex in very negative ways and
Yeah, depressing things.
the ways that it can be harmful, the ways that it doesn't work well. But we often, in this podcast at least, try and find things, find texts and pieces of pop culture where it's more interesting and perhaps more fun.
Mm. Mhm, mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense to me.
What about you, Ayani?
Yeah, so I'm looking at sex in a completely different way because a lot of my research is thinking about desire and how we enact desire. But I think I
Hmm.
also, and feel free to disagree with me, Corinne, but I think a little bit more about form and materiality than
Mm.
you do.
Well, that makes
So,
sense, especially since you're like a comics scholar,
yeah, yeah.
and not just comics, but I think your tagline is comics and animation these
Right.
days.
Yeah. I broaden out sometimes and say like image texts because now I'm going to be writing about that cell phone game that we'll talk about at a later date. But yeah, so since my focus is a lot on the image and how images are used. I think a lot about how desire is projected and depicted. And desire, both like, yes, sexual desire, right? But desire kind of broadly. So, in a way, like Corinne is thinking about consent, but broadly, I'm also thinking about desire, but a little broadly. My
Mhm.
dissertation honestly has, because dissertations never quite go the way you expect them to, is now kind of circling a bit more around sexual desire. But what I say that my dissertation is about is thinking about monsters, monstrosity, and desire for the monstrous body. So one of the chapters that I'm kind of finalizing right now is thinking about the cross section between violence as a kind of desire and sex as a kind of desire.
Mm.
But my other chapters, I think, are going to be focused more on depictions of desire, right? How images cause you to have desiring feelings for them, desiring gazes, etc. But also how there are certain kinds of games and media that really play into different kinds of desire that we have and
Mhm.
really amp those up and play into them and create these weird kind of desiring relationships with figures that don't actually exist. So,
Mhm.
yeah, so I do think a lot about how we depict sex, I think, and how that works, what meaning it can take on, how audiences are engaging with it, that kind of a thing. And I think, honestly, one of the best examples I think of our two conversations meeting is our episode on Bridgerton. If you want to take a pause and go listen to that, it's a long one, but it's a good one. But in that episode, we both had conversations about how Daphne and the Duke were depicted and shot and how the
Mhm.
cameras were working and how colors were working. But then we also had a very long conversation about consent and how it either was or wasn't working in their relationships.
Mhm.
So we kind of, I think one of the things that's great about this podcast is A, we can take a step back from the nature of our research, but
Mhm.
still have these conversations that are floating around, things that we're reading a lot about, research that we're doing, and things
Mhm.
that we're watching and enjoying. It allows us to, nerd out a little bit about things that are fun, but also, this is why we say it's quote unquote semi scholarly, right? Because we are leaning on our expertise here.
And there's definitely an aspect of it where we can't turn off analysis
Yeah.
brain, like,
Mhm,
even
mhm.
for, like, K-dramas that I'm watching, like, my analysis brain is still there. I just
Right.
try to ignore it some of the time, but also, like, sometimes a lot of the time, like, if the power dynamics are too wonky and the so
Mhm,
I know that
mhm.
consent isn't legitimate, I can't enjoy it.
Yeah, it becomes a little weird. No, I get that. We've actually had a lot of conversations about, like, when monstrosity is part of the romance, how does that change the power dynamics? So,
Mhm.
but that brings up an interesting question that I know you and I have talked about privately, but I don't know if we've ever really talked about it with the pod is what are the struggles from doing this kinds of research? I know you post about it sometimes on your Instagram, right? The things that are difficult for you, but like what is are there things that you struggle with in doing this research? Are there things that are more difficult for you rather than just like, I don't know, talking about costumes in Shakespeare or something? Not to
I'm
downplay costumes in Shakespeare. I think that's absolutely fascinating, but yeah.
I mean, maybe to start with something a little obvious and a little bit silly is when I'm writing about sex, there are not a lot of synonyms for it. So, like,
Oh my god, okay, not to cut you off, but, like, one of the things I always laugh about is in my master's thesis, I was talking about how a character was bare-breasted all the time, and that mattered to the story. I'm not gonna go into that. But there are not so many synonyms for breasts that you can use in, like, an academic setting. I can't be like, "And then her titties was out, and then it was her boobs." Like, I
well,
can't
and
I
it's
can't
like
do
when you're
that.
writing that, like, about characters who, like, had sex, like you say they had sex, you can say they slept together, but that's not necessarily specific
Right,
because
mhm.
you want to be specific about what you're talking about. But, like, you can't be like, and then they did it, and then they banged it out. Like, I can't say that in an article. That's not professional.
I will say though, one of my favorite asides in my dissertation is a joke about getting in those guts, but it's like literal because like there are guts, but it's the whole thing. But yeah, so I get it. It's hard. And it's hard not to make those jokes about like, yeah, they was getting it in. Moving on, furthermore.
I know that in the red, white, and royal blue episode, like, we talked a lot we like sort of made fun of the author for saying like using the phrase like getting dicked down a lot, which like I think was perhaps fair of us, but also like it's hard out there to like write
It's
about
hard.
sex.
Mhm, mhm,
Just
mhm.
like from a language
A
point of view.
Yeah, from a literal writing about sex point of view. I know that, and this is leaning into that somewhat silly. It's sometimes hard to, for me, talk about the research that I'm doing in the fullness of the research.
Oh my god, yeah.
So, because, and I don't know if I've said this publicly yet, but some of the things that I'm researching are pornographic texts, right? And I remember I was commenting about something completely unrelated to my research. And I had typed in a chat, oh, like the game Monster Prom. And then someone was like, oh, I really hope you meant to type prom. And it made me think a lot about my research, actually, because some of the things I'm looking at is monster porn. But there was this immediate kind of revulsion and reaction to even the thought of monster porn as being a thing that exists. So to be like, ah, yes, time to talk to you about this pornography featuring monsters. It's just kind of how it hard to navigate how you do that in an academic setting and be taken seriously,
Mm,
you know? Because I do think it's important to think about these things, to think about how people are using monsters to represent different kinds of desire that they feel and have, or have these different kind of conversations. But if people are automatically going to be like, oh man, monster porn, that's weird, it's like, okay, but it's something that I take seriously, you
mhm.
know? And that I have to take it seriously because I feel like no one else will take me seriously if I don't. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think that brings up an tangentially, like, I think the question of tone is one that is very
Mm,
interesting when, like, we're talking
yeah,
about sex, both, like, in our research and on the podcast, because we like to make a lot of jokes,
we do.
in case that wasn't clear. But, like, the question of, like, how jokey you can be when you're talking
Mhm.
about
Mhm.
sex, like so, like, for example, in the chapter and this is another thing that is sometimes difficult for me in my research, just, like, emotionally, like, I spent a long time on my chapter on depictions of sexual assault because, like, it was just very,
Mhm.
very
Mhm.
heavy and very
Yeah.
difficult and hard to sit with, and it's just emotionally hard, and one of the ways I
Yeah.
sometimes
Mhm.
sort of,
Mhm.
like my like knee-jerk reaction is to like make dark jokes about it, which is like not necessarily appropriate.
Yeah.
But
So, yeah.
so I guess
Mhm.
the two things I'm sort of bringing up there are like sometimes it is emotionally difficult, particularly when looking at like the darker side of
Yeah.
things related to
Mhm.
sex, but also like the question of being taken seriously, but also like the question of it's like another one of the things we have on our little note document is like the personal slash impersonal ways we talk about
Yeah.
sex. It's
Mhm.
often
Mhm.
impossible to talk about sex in a way that is
Mm.
impersonal because
Mhm. Mhm.
and I think it's
Mhm.
a little bit easier to do that in an academic context and other spaces, but like
Yeah.
I know like sometimes when I talk about my research, people are like they assume things about me because I
Oh,
research stuff related
interesting.
to sex that it's like that is not it.
No, I totally get that, and this is, I know we keep saying these examples are silly, but this is kind of a silly example. In one of the sections that I was writing, I was trying to think of how much detail I needed to go into of explaining why things are sexy, right?
Yeah.
Because on one hand, I can't just be like, well, I think that's hot. So clearly, academically speaking, it's hot, right? But one of the things that I was writing about were erogenous zones. And on one hand, it's like, I think people have an understanding perhaps of what I mean when I say erogenous zones, or why, like, you know, a character doing this one thing is supposed to be perceived as sexy. But then on the other hand, it's like, okay, well, maybe I have to actually back this up. So it's again that weird kind of like, I can't cite my experience, right? Because also A, that's my business, but also B, I can't be like, well, this happened to me that one time and this is how I felt about it. So clearly, so it's weird in trying to figure out like how much you have to cite something. Like one of the notes I made to my advisor was like, do I have to like define foreplay? Can I just let that rock? And she was like, please no, you do not have to define that. in your chapter. And I was like, oh, thank God, because I didn't know what I was going to do. So, I mean, that's more from like a what do we actually put on the page kind of a conversation. But I think it's the same kind of a thing. Like, what kind of assumptions are people making about you because of this work that you're doing? Right.
Well, and that also makes me think of the question of how, I don't know, explicit to be, which is something that I think
Mm-hmm.
we think about on the podcast is like how specific do we want to be when we're talking about
Yeah.
different sex stuff?
Yeah.
Because
Mm-hmm.
like sometimes like we don't gotta be specific and that's fine. But
Right.
also, I don't know, like I'm thinking for example of especially in our earlier episodes on The Great
Oh,
and
the
on
classic chaos episode. Yes.
and like on Roswell, like they have because Roswell was on the CW, so it's like on television, so it's not as explicit in what it is showing
Right.
as The Great is.
Yeah.
But like thinking about how specifically to talk about what was depicted in the shows and just like I don't know, because something that I think we get used to and have been perhaps a little bit desensitized to by like looking at sex so much in our research is that like we and I think it's sometimes healthy to talk about things related to sex in like a forthright, down to earth kind of way, because
Sure. Yeah.
a
Yeah.
lot of
Yeah.
the times like a lot of sex scenes in YA happen off stage and are left like unseen, and I think that
Mhm.
that
Yeah.
is
Mhm.
fine, but that also leaves I don't know, some things to the imagination, and like if you have
Yeah,
young readers,
absolutely.
their imaginations can be like a little bit wild. So
Uh-huh.
I'm not exactly sure where I'm going with this, but like the question of
No,
how
no.
specific to be, I think, is a difficult one, and I don't know that we always get it right.
Yeah, I can kind of pick that up here. I think it's also interesting navigating this space of the podcast versus the space of our research.
Mhm.
And one of the things that I feel like we both think about the podcast, though Corinne can, of course, disagree with me here, but this is a kind of a place for us to explore these conversations in a way that does not feel as strict
Mhm.
as in our own
Oh
academic
yeah, I mean,
work.
like we don't gotta have
But
citations for the podcast.
right, right. But still kind of figuring out and mitigating how we want to have these conversations. Because one of the things that's different, say, about our research is not many people are going to read my dissertation, right? I mean, if you want to read it, I'm sure it will be out there for you to read, but not many people are going to be reading that. Whereas on the flip side, we hope as many people as possible are going to listen to us on the podcast. So the question of audience, which we always talk about, I know, but the question of audience and
Mhm.
how we are conveying things to a particular audience, how we're talking about these things, what is the expectation of our audience in these conversations? Like having to move back and forth between like, okay, we're recording, so this is one audience versus okay, I'm doing this piece, I'm doing this article, that's another audience is another kind of layer that we have to mitigate that kind of becomes a little difficult and changes how impersonal or personal we want to be. Like there are some things we talk about on here that I would never talk about in my research, right? But I think there's also things in my research that I wouldn't necessarily bring to the podcast,
Mhm.
you know? So,
Well, and like thinking about the kinds of things that we choose to look at and how they relate to sex. Like one of the things
sure.
we jokingly put a poll on our Instagram stories about was like whether we should do an episode on the Rogers and Hammerstein Cinderella with Brandy in it when it dropped
Mhm,
on Disney
mhm.
Plus, and one of the I don't remember who it was, but someone's comment was like, "Well, that doesn't have sex in it." And it's like, okay, well, like no, it doesn't. Not explicitly. But, like, that is still something that, like, the questions of, like, sexiness and desirability and all those things as it related to, like, that fairy tale context, I think are still relevant and could have made for an interesting episode, although we didn't choose to do one on that, but we could have.
Well, I actually think that's a great segue to think a little bit about some of these topics that we had on our little bulleted note list. Because one of the things that you mentioned earlier, and I know comes up a lot in our podcast, and I wanted to kind of point to it, is this conversation about sex and power. But I think what you said about the fact that that version of Cinderella doesn't have sex in it speaks to perhaps the ways that it's not always about the explicit having of sex,
Mhm.
but conversations about romance and sexiness and desirability. So did you want to sit with like sex and power and then maybe desire and desirability for a second? I think they're linked.
Oh, yeah, they're
But
definitely linked. I mean, so circling back to, like, my my research, which has to do with consent, one of the things that I am always thinking about is, like, sex and power and, like,
Mhm, mhm.
who has power, and particularly something to think about with consent is, like, what happens if you say no? Like, if the
Right.
person you are saying no to has too much power or, like, the power
Mhm,
differential is too
mhm.
great, like, can you even say no at all?
Mm,
And so, like, that's something I'm always sort of always tracking, and, like, that's something, for example, that we thought about in It's Okay to Not Be Okay, like, with
right.
Komunyoung and Mugante, because Komunyoung had a lot more power in some senses,
Mm.
and just thinking about, like, the differential there, I think was tricky, especially at the
Yeah.
beginning. Let's see, what's another example where sex and power was,
I
uh
think The Great actually since we're kind of
yeah.
doing, like, a year retrospective here, our first episode on The Great was an excellent example of I mean, we were a little all over the place, but an excellent example of trying to navigate these conversations about sex and power
And
when you
that
have young
also,
oh,
oh, yeah, that also brings up the question of how what kind of power comes from experience.
yeah, mhm, mhm.
Like, power can also, it isn't just like this person is a king or an emperor or a duke, it could be this person knows a lot more, so that
Yeah.
you can use that knowledge in a way that perhaps is not beneficial to other people.
Sure. Exactly, and I think that's come up in quite a few of our episodes, honestly. So this conversation about sex and power, I think, is impossible to ignore
Mhm.
in a lot of the conversations that we've had, even if it's not explicitly about like, okay, they're having sex right now and it's a power dynamic in the bedroom, right?
Mhm.
Um, so yeah, I think that's an excellent point. And not to move away from that like too fast. But you made me think about desire
Mhm.
and desirability while talking about those things because sometimes the play in the power dynamic is part of how whatever it is we're talking about is playing to our senses of desire,
Mhm.
right? Going back to The Great, one of the things that was really funny was when we were watching it, Corinne had a bit of a thing for what is it, Nicholas Holt? Is that his
Oh,
real
yeah, yeah,
name?
that's the actor's name.
Yeah, so but she while you were watching it, you're also like, "Man, this king is terrible. He's so terrible." But so it's interesting how thinking about the layers that are at play, right? We have the actors, we have the characters that they're playing, we have how they're interacting with each other, and how a lot of this is made to create senses of desire in the audience. Like
Mhm.
I think we keep coming back to some episodes specifically, and it's funny because they are the ones that have like some of the most sex in them, but that makes sense, right?
Mhm.
But thinking about Bridgerton, I know we talked a lot about the power dynamics in that episode, but also every single member of that cast was put together to make sure that you as an audience member had some sense of desire or desirability for them, at least most of the cast members.
Mhm.
I think that's fair to say. But, like, the fact that everyone was so thirsty for the Duke, though I will say Boxing Man William was top tier
Okay,
for
we
me.
know you stan.
But the fact that people were so, so hot for the Duke is honestly what made some of our conversations about him more interesting, right? Because of what the show is trying to do to make you attracted to him so that perhaps you look at some of the things he does in a different light, right?
Mhm.
So,
Well, and also thinking of the question of desire and desirability and how I
desire and liability.
and but thinking of the question of desire and desirability and how I sometimes am a little bit hot for characters in television shows that are the villain that are not people that I would be like hot for in real life. I think it's also worth thinking about the question of remove and
Yes. Mhm.
fantasy and how it, so, like, I know that, like, Peter is a sociopath in The Great. I am aware of this. This is not a thing that has to be explained to me. But but, like, that sort of fantasy, I think, is maybe part of it. And I'm speaking of fantasy here, and, like,
Mm.
something that is fun to imagine or perhaps interesting to watch is not something I would actually like to live.
Yeah. Mhm, mhm. And that, I think, is a really interesting place when we're thinking about sex,
Mhm.
right? Is this idea of fantasy as a thing that you like to imagine, but not necessarily something you want to experience. Yeah, and I think that's something that definitely plays into a lot of the things that we are talking about in this podcast, right? Because
Mhm.
it's not like we're necessarily like, ah, yes, this character, I would sleep with them. No, that's not what it's about.
most
But it
most
is
of the
kind
time.
most of the time. But it is about like but but it is as we blow up our own spot. But it is about kind of how these shows play with that fantasy of desirability, even if it is not something you would actually want to put up with in real life.
Mhm.
Yeah, and of course, there are times for us to be a little thirsty as well. It wouldn't, yeah, obviously. So, as a kind of wrap up question, right? What do you hope that people get out of our conversations that we're having, thinking about sex, power, desire, etc.?
I mean, I think maybe the most important thing to me is to for people to potentially think more critically, and I don't mean like
Mm,
cynically, but like just think
yeah.
more carefully about depictions of sex and what they suggest and what they normalize in like the
Mhm.
different kinds of media that we consume, because it's okay for some things to be normalized and there are other things that have been normalized that are not okay.
Mm.
And I think if we are aware of them as fantasies or like as separate from reality, then it's maybe a little bit it's better to be aware of like that remove than to just sort of like unconsciously consume it, and to just like
Sure.
think about these things more carefully, particularly, and I know I keep saying it, but particularly when it comes to consent and what we think is normal
Sure.
that perhaps shouldn't be.
No, I think that's great. And honestly, what I hope is very similar to that,
Mhm.
but taking it in a little bit different direction. So I'm not just saying the same thing as you. I think what I hope is that people feel more comfortable having these
Mm.
conversations, and are more willing to have these conversations, right? Because I know sometimes it can be awkward to talk about sex, but removed from your own personal experience, right?
Well, but I
Uh,
would also say that it is, I think, easier to start thinking about sex when it is removed from your personal
oh,
experience
sure,
rather
absolutely.
than when you're like, and this is precisely what happened to me.
Yeah, no, 100%. But I keep thinking about, like, if you're sitting in a room watching a movie with your parents and then all of a sudden there's an unexpected sex scene and it's
Mm.
like, "Oh boy, I get to watch this with my folks," you know? But I'm hoping that having like, listening to our podcast, listening how we talk about sex, maybe spark some thoughts of your own, and maybe you take those conversations on and go speak with other people. Yeah, I think I think we should be talking about sex more in a variety of different contexts.
Mhm.
That is a much larger conversation for another day. But at the very least, if our podcast helps you to think a bit more critically about sex in the media that you're watching, but also maybe makes you spark a conversation with somebody that's deeper than just like the Duke was hot, you know? Though, again, feel free to talk about the Duke being hot. No judgment there. But, like, you know, if you feel inspired to take those conversations a little bit farther, then, like, I feel like we've put a little good out into the world with our sexy time conversations.
Yeah, that's a nice way to put it.
Yay! I done good. I done good.
So if you'd like to join the conversation with us,
Ha ha!
so plugging our social media, you can find us at Sex Love Lit, all one word, on Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter. We would really love to hear your thoughts on this or any of the other things that we've talked about. Please find us and give us a follow.
Yeah. Also, our DMs are open. I know that's weird to add at the end of a sex conversation, but we do like talking to our listeners. We do like to hear your feedback. We do like to hear the kinds of things that you like us to talk about in the future. Corinne and I obviously have buckets and buckets full of things that we get interested in, but if there's something that you're really curious about or you'd like to hear more about, let us know. Drop us a line. For our upcoming episodes in July, our deep dive is going to be Your Name, aka Kimi no Nawa, which is a tear jerky anime film that I cannot wait to force Corinne to watch. We may have a special guest in that episode because my spouse is like, when you guys talking about your name?
I
So
mean,
he may join
I'm
us.
unclear if that means he's coming on the podcast or he just wants to make me watch the movie.
I am also unclear, which is why we might have a special guest. But beyond that deep dive, keep your eyes peeled for the next in this kind of little retrospective series, which is going to be Why Love, which I think is interesting to separate from sex in our conversation.
Mhm.
But there might be a little bit of overlap, but I think we have some different kind of feelings about why love specifically is part of the title. So keep your eyes peeled for those. As always, we may decide to go in a completely different direction and give you something fun and new and exciting. But those are what we have on the docket.
But yeah, thanks for listening.
Yeah, and look forward to more, I suppose. This has been La Petite Sex Love Literature, and we'll see you next time.
Bye.
Bah!